Your health sucks, and so do your all seasons. Continuing down the path of maximizing your all season progress, today we're going to be covering some of the risks associated with PED use in the off season, some potential strategies to help you manage that, and why I don't think enough of you take care of your health in order to maximize your progress in the off season. As we step into what needs to be managed for bodybuilders throughout these all-season phases with PEDs in play, we need to understand where the risk lies. What categories or sectors of the human body are going to see the highest levels of risk? What are those risks? And potentially, where do we test or how do we monitor these categories for the risks associated within each one of them? So we're going to be covering 4 primary ones. It's going to be cardiac, renal, brain, and liver, as these are going to be the 4 primary considerations for risks within bodybuilders and PED use. And we're going to kick it off with cardiac risk. This is, if you want to think of it this way, the silent killer of bodybuilders, because it's more chronic in nature, the way the risk is associated with PED use. We see athletes with chronically elevated red blood cells. We see athletes with chronically elevated high blood pressure, leading these athletes to potentially seeing left ventricular hypertrophy, potentially blood clots, and long-term cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events. And the reason is because these things accumulate over time. So this is where we're going to be following those lab work markers for CBCs to check on those red blood cells, counts, size, all the characteristics that you would need to look through in a CBC in order to kind of see the entryway into cardiac management from a lab work perspective. However, that's not going to be enough. We are going to need some cardiac testing to be a part of an athlete's process. For most, this is going to be an echocardiogram every year to every other year, some sort of calcium scoring as well to kind of assess risk on that front. And these are going to be constants in regards to some of the testing that bodybuilders are going to need to have in order to monitor the risk within the cardiac realm. Then as we phase over into renal, a lot of this is going to be closely associated with the cardiac side because we're going to see these chronically high blood pressures start to negatively impact these athletes on the renal side as well, with the high influence of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system leading to these high blood pressures, causing stress on the kidneys, and for some athletes leading them to kidney failure. So we need to be able to accurately track kidney markers as well within lab work, which is going to be looking at filtration rates and other aspects of that within the labs. Cystatin Cs for most athletes are going to be a little bit more accurate because the higher level of muscularity is going to lead to higher levels of creatinine production, which will skew the EGFRs on most lab work that use that creatinine equation for calculating that. So the Cystatin C is going to be a little bit more of an accurate way for these highly muscular individuals to check on that. Then as we head into brain, we need to understand that PEDs have neurotoxic effects that are going to lead to potentially beta amyloid accumulation, which is tied closely in with some of the Alzheimer's research. And we're going to see potentially some lower cognitive performance, not only the grogginess that you experience during prep, but because of the neurotoxicity of some of the compounds that are used within the PED realm, within bodybuilders, you potentially could see that wane over time. Especially for athletes who have the higher risk of Alzheimer's and dementia, this would definitely be something that I would be watching for within those athletes. Then finally, as we head into liver, the primary things we're looking for are going to be liver toxicity, reduced bile flow, and insulin resistance, causing some issues with overall liver health. And this is going to be something that we really need to monitor, especially with athletes using high levels of orals, because this is going to increase that risk for the liver profile and the liver markers within the athlete as we look to maintain the health of this athlete across the long duration of their competing career. Now, as coaches in the industry, we know the risks, so what do? How do we help these athletes prevent this? I covered some of the things that are going to be done from a lab work perspective and a health testing perspective, but there are certainly things that we can do within the plan in order to help these athletes manage these potential risks and lower the risk for their journey through bodybuilding. First one's going to be cardiovascular activity. This is a great way to keep cardiovascular health in check. This is going to improve things across the board for athletes when it comes to response to food, ability to train, blood pressure management, and just overall general health and well-being, which is a huge aspect of the plan. For athletes that get really deep in the all season, this is where some low volume HIIT can even be utilized in order to help manage the health metrics on the cardiac side, especially with the blood pressure metrics, and is a very valuable tool to use with your athletes in the depths of all season where blood pressure tends to rise the most. This will lead to also blood pressure medication for some athletes. We know PED's influence on renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Typically, most athletes are going to start with either an ARB or an ACE inhibitor, knowing that it's going to have that angiotensin influence. But just general blood pressure medication can be huge for managing the health metrics for these athletes. So the big thing is to not get hung up on a specific blood pressure medication. It's more to focus on the result of managing blood pressure for these athletes. Yes, certain blood pressure medications are going to have all-site actions that can be beneficial for bodybuilders, but it's more so just to understand the classes, what they do, and how they could potentially detriment your process. Big one that comes to mind is the beta blockers section of blood pressure medication, but just understand which one you're getting on, ask your doctor questions, and use this as a tool to help manage your blood pressure to limit cardiovascular risk in the future. And blood glucose management is going to be a big one, especially through all season phases. And I put a quote from a paper, it's an Owens paper, that talks about the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects that insulin can have in managing blood glucose throughout lowering the risk for cardiovascular disease and improving endothelial function. And I put this quote here because I think blood glucose management can receive hype on some end, but is also undervalued by others. And it's something that really needs to be done across the board. It's not just throwing insulin at the problem. It's going to be keeping body composition in check, choosing high quality foods on a day in, day out basis, using insulin when it's needed, but doing your cardiovascular activity as well so that you can manage your blood glucose better on your own. And the combination of all of these variables contributing to blood glucose management rather than the path that most bodybuilders tend to go down of just chucking medications at the problem. And the final ones are just going to be consistent health checks. This is going to be lab work every 12 to 16 weeks, echocardiograms once a year or every other year. And then especially for the females that are pursuing physique development, using HRT when that's needed for these athletes. This can help these athletes lower the risk of low estradiol environments and HPO adapted states, where they can see much better improvements, not only on the outcomes of the process for muscle building, but managing their health across the duration of their career as well. So make sure this is something you're focusing on. If it's not a realm that you feel comfortable in, we have plenty of resources at J3 University for you guys to check out, but also don't feel bad for referring out. You have the medical community to work with. I highly recommend you educate yourself as well throughout this process, but make sure you're not ignoring this and just pushing it off to the side. Make sure you're doing your due diligence and managing your health markers across the entirety of the all-season phases.